All right, welcome back to English 2130. Today I want to give an introduction for the Revolutionary and early national period. So this is basically picking up from the age of exploration and the early colonial period. So there are a lot of changes going on in the world that will sort of birth what we like to call the Enlightenment. And in many ways, the Enlightenment is what leads to the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and probably the next 100 years of revolutions all over Western Europe. So, how did we get to this period of the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason? So, if we go back in history a little bit uh, to the Renaissance in the 15th century or so, we have a rebirth, a rediscovery of the classical world. Aristotle, Plato, the famous playwrights, Aeschylus and Euripides, and so this entire ancient world of classical learning from Greece and Rome. The Roman Empire falls around 500 AD or so and ushers in about 900 years of what historians call the Dark Ages. Now, the Dark Ages weren't completely dark. There was a lot of philosophy and learning going on in culture, but it was all centered around the church. So if you wanted to be successful in many ways, you sort of had to become a priest or a monk or be associated with the church in some ways. So there was a lot of sort of apologetics, a lot of philosophy going on in the church. So it wasn't all dark age, but when they say dark ages, they mean the secular world sort of disappears. The ancients had been less concerned with religion and more concerned with philosophy and so on. So if we put it in perspective, if you think 900 years from the fall of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance, that's like from the year 1123 until today, just about. So that's a long period of time. But we talked about the Ottoman Empire and how after it collapsed, a lot of scholars from Byzantium, from the Byzantine Empire, who had kept track of all this Greek and Roman knowledge, sort of moved back west into Italy. And so that helped spur on the Renaissance. There became more of a fascination with the human body in a realistic way. We've all seen the Leonardo da Vinci portraits and paintings that take the human body and try to portray it in a realism. If you look at ancient Greek sculpture, they try to capture like the David, they try to capture the body in a realistic way. And then in the medieval times, the artwork is a lot more crude looking to us. They don't care as much about capturing reality. So we have a return to this. We have the Protestant Reformation, where the Catholic Church is challenged. And so Martin Luther and others reformed the church in the sense that they said you don't need an interceding figure. You don't have to have a pope or a cardinal or someone to confess your sins to. You can go directly to God. So this communication opens up directly between the average person and God. They don't have to go through the mediating institution of the church. You have a lot of changes in the ways that people look at religion, that it's not something that they have to necessarily obey an earthly authority, that they can figure it out for themselves. And so there's a turning inward and saying, well, I should be able to read the Bible in my language and determine how I want to see things and how I want to relate to God. And so we have all of these Protestant denominations that come about, and they all have different beliefs, different ways of doing things. But that's a very key change because it says I can decide for myself what I think and what I believe based upon my own reasoning and my own judgment. Along with this, you have the scientific revolution, where we have empiricism, which is knowledge gained through experience or observation rather than simply being told what to believe, that you can actually learn about nature, you can learn about your environment through observation. Being skeptical of received wisdom and testing received wisdom. So, this idea of skepticism, looking for a rational explanation for phenomenon. And then we have the emergence of what we might call deism, or what they did call deism, which is the notion that God sort of creates the universe and then sets everything into motion, but doesn't intervene in every little thing that happens. So that by studying nature, by studying natural laws, physics, biology, that we're actually learning about God's creation. So that deists believe in God, but they just don't believe that God, is at work every day on the earth. That sort of, it's like a watchmaker that winds up the watch and just lets it tick. So these are big differences in the way people think, from the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, scientific revolution. Um, and so this sort of helps them to enter this period that we call the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. So to summarize that, we have all beliefs and traditions should be subject to the test of reason and logic. And this includes authority, government, that people can use reason and logic to decide for themselves whether a government is legitimate or illegitimate, whether power is legitimate or illegitimate. They can be skeptical of received wisdom. Empiricism, scientific method, the idea that right and wrong exist independently of government or authority. So things are right not because an authority figure says they're right because they conform with the laws of nature, natural law. Individual liberty and religious tolerance. This is what we might call liberalism. Liberalism is the notion that uh, you have individuals are entitled to their own opinions and they're entitled to their own way of life, and so that they should not be silenced um, according to their opinions. Religious tolerance. So you have all these years of religious wars in Europe between the Catholics and the Protestants, and so this whole notion that people should be able to just worship the way they please. You can see that in all of these examples, received wisdom and received authority is challenged. Also, the idea of consent of the governed. So, if we remember the Puritans, they had the Mayflower Compact. And in a lot of ways, the Protestant Reformation, when people were disconnected from the authority of the Catholic Church, they had to make up their own more democratic sort of ways of organizing themselves. And so we see this with the Puritans and the Compact, the idea that if you're going to accept authority and governance, that you have to assent to it. So we get the idea of a constitution, constitutional government from this idea. And John Locke's tabula rasa. And the tabula rasa, if you remember from school, says that people are not born good or evil. They're born as a blank slate. That's what tabula rasa means. So, environment then affects people's personality and development. So, the idea that if we create a better environment for people, that they will become better people, that it's not just about obeying or not obeying, about punishment, being punished if you don't obey, and then doing the right thing because you don't want to be punished. I mean, we all look back at the Dark Ages, and all these strange torture devices and punishments meant to scare people into obedience. Whereas in the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, they would say, no, people can be brought to being good by understanding, right? This goes back to a classical notion, an Aristotelian notion that to know the good is to do the good. And so you have a real sea change from the Renaissance going forward of the way that people think about society, the way that people think about government. So liberalism and republicanism. Republicanism simply means representative government, that not everything is a direct democracy where if you have 1,000 people in the city, then you have 1,000 people vote on every little matter, that you can elect a representative to go and vote in your place, so that we have senators, congressmen. This is the idea of representative government. So all of these things are percolating. They're developing in Europe and, of course, also in the colonies because the colonies culturally are attached to Europe, to England. And so over time, we see this diminishing of the Puritanism. As they land in Plymouth, they start a colony, but as the colony starts to succeed and more people come over, the authority and the concentration of the Puritan power and authority starts to weaken a bit because you have a lot of people who are unchurched people, a lot of people who aren't necessarily there for religious reasons. They might come for economic reasons, or they just want a better life, or they want opportunities. And a couple of things that sort of hurt the power of the Puritans over the years was the restoration of King Charles II. In England, you had sort of a revolution where the um, Cromwell and the Roundheads took power and executed the king, and England didn't have a king for a little while, and they were Puritans. They were sort of religious extremists. But then eventually, King Charles II comes back to power, and so uh, the colonies start to diversify a little bit. The new king isn't as concerned with just religion. He grants colonies for other reasons, maybe religious tolerance, maybe to do this or to that reason. So, just like Jamestown was sort of started for different reasons than Plymouth, we get more colonies kind of like in the Jamestown mold rather than in the Plymouth mold. We also have the Salem witch trials, which happened at the end of the 17th century. And so this is kind of like I've seen it described as the high water mark or a watershed moment. The Salem witch trials, around 20 people were executed over a panic. And even people at the time, it didn't take them long to know that something really crazy had happened, and all these people had been executed for silly reasons. And so that really struck a chord in a lot of people that maybe they had gone too far, that maybe the Puritan authorities were untethered a bit and had too much power. And so this left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. When we get to the mid 19th century, we'll read Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Hawthorne was from New England. And the topic of his writing is a lot of, an exploration of this Puritan mindset, where he's looking back at the many, many years before and, what went wrong with the Puritans and what was going on back then. So, things like the Scarlet Letter is an exploration of the Puritan psychology. Um, young Goodman Brown. So we have a lot of fascination with the Puritans in as New England matures and develops as a literary place. Now, some Enlightenment values actually complemented Puritan values, and so we see this strange hybrid start to form in the United States. In some ways, exemplified by Benjamin Franklin. So, if you think about Benjamin Franklin, we have one vision of him, out with a kite attached to a key, trying to do research on electricity. So he's interested in the scientific world. He also writes the almanac, where he gives all this advice like early to bed, early to rise, makes you healthy, wealthy, and wise. And so it's all about self-discipline and hard work and application leads to good things, and success is very important. So we see this melding of some of these Enlightenment values and Puritan values. So the Enlightenment thinkers might say that progress is important and it can be gained through reason and effort. Well, the Puritans said hard work and success, that's all a signifier of election, that you're one of the elect. And so you show that you're of the elect by working hard and not giving in to all of these temptations for things that would keep you from being successful. Um, the Enlightenment thinkers focus on the importance of the individual, whether it's an individual relationship with God or individual rights, liberalism, the right to have your own opinions and speak your mind. Whereas the Puritans had an interesting relationship with individualism too, because they believed in this covenant relationship with God. that your relationship with God was a personal relationship. And so that sort of reinforces the sense that each individual person is important. And then we have personal responsibility, the enlightenment. If people are going to have all this freedom, then with freedom comes responsibility. And so, people can use reason and discipline in order to achieve things. So that means they're responsible for themselves. Whereas the Puritans believed in piety and humility. Remember the Puritan plain style, and they didn't want to indulge too much in things that would keep them from the right path. So we see a sort of a natural fit in Massachusetts and New England, of this sense of enlightenment values of progress and success and reason and hard work. It kind of fits right into a lot of the Puritan values that were at play. Science and philosophy are become much more important than religion. Now, we do have the Great Awakening, where a lot of people felt that maybe people had lost track of religion a bit. And so we have the Great Awakening in the US, where a lot of people convert back to an evangelical style of Christianity. But this time it's much more emotional. This time it's, outward displays and so on. Um, Maybe in some ways that's a reaction to deism, whereas deism says we're not going to worry so much about theology, we're just going to study creation. Um, Puritan typology, if you remember, typology is when Puritans look for signs of God's will in every little thing that happens. Like if a little bee lands on a tombstone, then that's God telling you that He wants you to think about this person. That's sort of a way of thinking that is very common with the Puritans, this typology. But it seems very old fashioned and quaint to Enlightenment thinkers who were much more scientific and rigorous in their reason and logic, um, because they believe that the universe acts independently of God for the most part. So I mentioned the Great Awakening earlier, but there is a connection between the humanistic turn, the focus on human experience that we see in the Enlightenment, and the emotional nature of the Great Awakening, because people are very much interested in their experience of God, of communicating that experience of God to others. So it's just kind of an interesting mix of attitudes that are percolating in the late 1600s leading into the 1700s. Now, in the South, as we talked about with Jamestown, uh, we know that the South wasn't really interested as much in religion as it was in commerce. And that commerce was primarily agricultural. In the North, they had a slightly different economy. They did have a lot of agriculture, but they also had a lot of other things going on, like shipbuilding and different imports, exports. They just had a different economy. The South was always much more agrarian, and that's how money was made. And in order to make money in agriculture in the pre-industrial times, you needed human labor. Now, the story of slavery in the South really starts in the North and the South. But the earliest slaves came to Virginia in 1619. There was a ship. It wasn't even heading to Virginia, but they were out of food and supplies, and so they stopped near Jamestown and wanted to trade for food and water and supplies, and all they had on board were slaves. So they traded for the slaves, and that was in 1619. By 1620, Virginia had about 32 Africans, but historians aren't sure whether they were slaves or indentured servants, because there was this status of labor called indentured servitude, where you would sign up a contract to work for someone for a certain number of years to pay off your passage to the New World. So a lot of people who couldn't afford to come to the New World would say, okay, well, I'll work for you for 5 years or 7 years. And then when I'm done working for you and I learn a trade and I get established, then I can just do my own thing. Now, as we'll see as the years go on, the status of indentured servants um, and Africans who were brought over as slaves begins to split. So at first, you didn't have a lot of slaves in the United States because indentured servants took care of most of the labor. Um, but in England, you saw a rise in wages. And so people weren't as willing to sign 5-year, 7-year deals for passage if they had money of their own, or they didn't have to come to the New World if they had opportunities. So the indentured servant pool sort of starts to dry up. Now, Native Americans had been enslaved in the New World for many years, but they tended to die of disease. And so a lot of the planters turned to the African slave trade. Now, by 1640, there were quite a few free Africans also living in Virginia, and some of them even owned slaves. So slavery hadn't become as central to the economy as it would become. Um, but as African slavery becomes more important to the economy, you start to see the laws change in a lot of these states. So the status of Africans um, starts to split from the status of European indentured servants, where we start to see much more of laws, race-based laws, because it was too complicated, I suppose, to keep track of who's an indentured servant, who's a slave, can a slave become free and become an indentured servant? And so a lot of these laws were based upon race. Now, slavery had always been a reality in the world. If we remember, Captain John Smith was captured by the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, and forced into slavery, and he had to kill his master and escape back to Europe. But what's different about the Western Hemisphere in the slave trade is that it becomes much more strictly racialized. And so a lot of the laws that are written in the colonies in the 1600s are meant to sort of box Africans in so that they don't have the same rights as other groups, so that it's easier to maintain this system of hereditary slavery. Um, so it becomes very racialized very early on. So around the 1660s, we see laws that are making slavery hereditary, so that if you're a slave, your children will also be a slave. We see people who are punished. So let's say that an African American is punished. Well, he might be sentenced to lifetime of servitude, whereas a European might have their indentured servitude expanded by 4 more years. And so you start seeing more people sort of diverted into slavery as more slaves are brought to the United States. Um, Now, there's always been opposition to slavery in the United States. The Quakers famously were anti slavery and were making arguments opposed to slavery. So there have always been those who oppose slavery on religious and moral grounds. But when you have something that is so central to the economy, where people's money is tied up in it, it's very hard to change it. So by the 1700s or so, tobacco, rice, and indigo um, are becoming cash crops in the South. Cotton wouldn't really be important until much later. Um, and so we see this increase in slavery because tobacco, rice, and indigo are all labor intensive. Now, the southern colonies were just had a perfect climate for these crops. So a lot of waterways for transportation. You could you could transport the crops and get them where they needed to be. Remember, they didn't have railroads or trucks back then, so you'd put them on boats and send them on their way. You had long growing seasons in the South where it's warm and sunny and rainy for most of the year. Um, you have good soil for these particular crops. So we see this replacement of indentured servants with African slaves. Um, And as the years go on, it becomes more and more central to the economic flourishing of these uh, plantations in these colonies. Um, so we also have a social difference in the North and the South. So we had the Puritans who were interested in work and industry and hard work and keeping your nose clean and good things will happen, what we might associate with the American dream. But the South was always different. The South didn't have that Puritan sensibility. Um, the South valued aristocratic wealth, so and leisure and being a man of leisure and they sort of saw themselves as wealthy aristocrats. If you think of like a feudal manor, right, you have the duke and he lives in the castle and then you have all the serfs or all the peasants working. They sort of saw themselves more like that, that they were very cultured and witty and rich, um, and they did all of this through their plantation system. Now, we have some early American literature from the South from this period. Most famously, William Byrd. He had a diary that he kept that's very important because it reveals a lot about the culture and the attitudes and daily life in the Southern colonies, and as well as his sort of dismissive attitudes towards the slaves. He'll play a lot of cruel tricks on them that he thinks are funny, and so you kind of get a sense of um, this chasm that opens up between who is considered fully human and who isn't. And so we start to see this. And in some ways, the slave system and the economic system almost sort of makes a race-based system necessary because how else can you justify the system unless you say, well, these people are lower, these people need us to take care of them because they can't take care of themselves. And so we see this sort of this racial consciousness, this gap start to open. And a lot of the art and poetry from the South of that time doesn't have the plain style and the religious element that we see in New England. A lot of it's more like neoclassical. It's trying to be like the ancients, using allusions from Greek mythology and so on. And so they're very much trying to copy European fashions and styles in the South at that time. All right. So out of this mix of different types of cultures, and we also have the Native Americans who, over the years, have sometimes been at war with and sometimes been allied to different European groups. Um, we start to see the road to the American Revolution. So sometimes we forget that the French, the Spanish, and the English all had colonies, they all had a presence. They were all trying to make money off of North America. And so um, after a while, the English and the French, they come to war. It's called the Seven Years' War. It's really a world war. And North America is just one of the theaters of this war between the English and the French. Now, the French and Indian War is interesting because the natives sided either with the English or the French. I think you had the Huron tribes in um, that were in present-day Ohio sided with the French. The Cherokee and the Iroquois voted or sided with the English. So you have sort of some tribes sided with the English, some sided with the French. And so they were very much involved in the fighting. If you look on a map, you see a lot of French place names in the United States, especially in the middle of the country. Um, we know that New Orleans has a French sort of imprint, and so the the end of the French and Indian War resulted in a French defeat. And so the English took over a lot of the middle of the United States, where we have then it would have been the West, Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, all the way down to West Virginia. So the French are sort of kicked out all the way down to New Orleans, even. Um, And so what came out of that war was that the English all of a sudden had a lot more to deal with. They had native tribes that had fought against them, some fought with them. We have a lot of colonists who gained military experience through the fighting. And we also have the English develop an expectation that the colonists should really pay for this war that was fought to help them. So the English had a very interesting, point of view, saying, "Well, we spent all this money for you, so you should pay us back." But from a colonial perspective, they might say, "Did you really do it for us, or did you do it for yourself? And why should you exploit us to pay for something that increased your power and prestige?" So you can see that the English expected the colonists to submit to repayment of what they saw as a debt. And then the colonists said, "Well, hold on a minute. We don't want to be exploited to pay for this war." Now, this starts off a chain of events because the Americans had always enjoyed a certain level of autonomy and self-government. The Americans, they thought of themselves as English, but they also thought of themselves as different, of unique, as being unique, and they also thought of themselves as a people who govern themselves. So when the English started tightening the grip on the colonists and saying, "Well, we're going to regulate your economic activity. We're going to tax you here. We're going to take money here. And if you don't like it, we're going to punish you." So it started off this sort of cycle where the way that I would characterize it would be that the British would act with too strong of a hand, too heavy handed. Um, and then the colonists would be offended by that. And then they would turn around and become a little bit more rebellious and resistant. And then the English would double down and try to show them who was the boss. And so it just created this cycle. And so there are all of these things you read about in history class, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Tea Act, where they were trying to exact taxation and control commerce in ways that the colonists didn't like. And eventually things come to a head. We have the Boston Tea Party, and then the Boston Massacre, which was really, if you look at it, it was a lot of really scared British soldiers who were being pelted with rocks and ice and intimidated, and somebody fired a shot, and the next thing you know, they were all shooting, and it was all a big mess. Well, the British came back with what are called the Intolerable Acts in 1774. And all of this is happening in Boston. So, Massachusetts, where the original Puritans had landed, this becomes the epicenter for what would kick off the American Revolution. Not Jamestown, but Boston. So the British saw it as punishment for continued disobedience. And so some of the things that they did that the colonists felt were intolerable, they dissolved elected offices. So there were the people that the colonists had elected who lost their positions and were replaced by British appointed officials. They closed the harbor. They established military rule, essentially, martial law. They restricted freedom of association because they knew that the colonists were meeting and conspiring and protesting and causing trouble. So they didn't want them to be able to meet. They also housed British troops with Boston families. And so all of these things were very unpopular. And so the the colonists found these things to be intolerable. Now, as things were heating up, the British decided that they would capture some weapons and gunpowder and ammunition because they could see where things were going and they wanted to go ahead and disarm the colonists so that the colonists wouldn't be as powerful to resist the things that they were doing. And so the British were marching to these arms stores and powder magazines, but the Americans had a militia movement. And the militia sent word out that the British were coming, and so they amassed at Lexington and Concord. And they sort of faced down the British army. The first shots of the revolution were fired. And when the British tried to retreat through the woods, they sort of went through a gauntlet um, of people just coming out of the woods and shooting them or attacking them the whole way back. And so this was a really huge thing because three-quarters of the casualties were actually British. Only one quarter were American. So the British knew that this was for real. And shortly after that, we have the Declaration of Independence. So the colonists knew that there was no going back at this point, no turning back. And so you're either in it all the way or you're not in it at all. So they came out with the Declaration of Independence. This established the rationale for independence, and a lot of the ideas behind this rationale are rooted in, guess what? The Enlightenment. So, Enlightenment ideas. So, the fact that if a king acts in an unjust way, that the people have the right to revolt, not based on the authority of the king, but based on natural law, or what we might consider nowadays human rights. So, the justification of revolution was rooted in these Enlightenment ideas. And so that's really important. Later, the French would pick up on a lot of these ideas and they would have a revolution of their own, but it's very different in character with the American Revolution. All right, so once the Battle of Yorktown um, and the British surrender in 1781, and so the these new Americans have to get together and say, oh, okay, well, how are we going to organize our governance? So around the time of the Declaration of Independence, they had come up with a governing structure called the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation, a confederation, it's more a collection of independent polities or states, and they all just sort of get together. No one's really in charge, but they all try to agree on basic things so that they can speak with one voice. But the Articles of Confederation had a lot of weaknesses and things that made it difficult to conduct business. First of all, there was no money. George Washington famously said, "What's wrong with the Articles of Confederation?" He said, "No money." Um, so they didn't really have a way of collecting money like taxes. It was all sort of hodgepodge. Different states had different ways of collecting money, and that some of them didn't want to pay into things, some of them did, different, but there was no real organized way to collect money to pay for war debts or stand up an army uh, or pay bondholders who had invested in the American Revolution. There was no way to put up a good defense against European powers. The English had been in charge of Florida, and so uh, they could pay Native American tribes to go up into Georgia and attack settlers if they wanted to. If a European power landed in Florida, they could mount an invasion, and if the Articles of Confederation meant that the states were too weak to stand up a military or have the money they would need to buy things, then how long would the country really survive? And so it was kind of like herding cats trying to get anything done. And so one group of people, of Americans, called the Federalists, said they wanted a stronger, more unitary central government that would separate the powers between a national government and state governments. There were certain things the states could do, but there were certain things that the national government would do. So the Federalists really wanted a nation. They wanted a single nation, not just a collection of states. Now, you also had a group that opposed the Federalists. They were the Anti Federalists. And so the Anti Federalists thought that they were the true Federalists. They favored a weaker central government and more direct democracy, which means just everyone voting on things, sort of the way we elect congressmen or the president, um, because they feared a return of a ruling class or a monarchy. The Federalists feared that the people would elect bad rulers, that demagogues could whip up the passions of the people, and so that you would have what they call the tyranny of simple majorities. So if you think if 51% of the people vote to take away your breakfast cereal, right, then you can't have any breakfast cereal because you're in the minority and the majority voted to take your breakfast cereal away from you. So the Federalists feared these simple majorities, um, and they wanted more representative government. They wanted more appointments. You know, in the United States, for many years, because of the Constitution, we appointed senators. We didn't elect senators. That's a more recent change that we elect senators. But the Anti-Federalists um, really wanted more of a sort of a populism, and where all the states had more power. Now, slavery was always an issue all the time in American history. And both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists used slavery in their arguments. So you had Northern Anti-Federalists who didn't like the Three-Fifths Compromise of the Constitution. Um, but the Three-Fifths Compromise was basically about half of the population of the colonial South was enslaved. So about half. And if you have representative government based on population, the southern states wanted to count all their slaves in terms of how many congressmen they would have, so that they would have an advantage over the northern states. But all of those slaves, of course, couldn't vote, so that they would have, so the southern states would have more representation in Congress, um, and power over the northern states. Uh, the northern states didn't want the southern states to count their slaves because they weren't citizens. Why should they count towards congressional representation? And so they came up with the three-fifths compromise, so that each slave would be counted as three-fifths of the total. Um, and so that way, the South could count their slaves for representation, but they wouldn't count as much as citizens, so then the South would have less representation. Well, the Anti-Federalists said, you know, we don't like the Three-Fifths Compromise because it enshrines slavery. It says slavery is okay in the Constitution. Of course, the Constitution would never be passed if it abolished slavery. Georgia and some of these other states never would have signed on. The Southern Anti-Federalists, who were pro-slavery, um, they were against the national government because they said that if we have a national government that's powerful, it might prohibit slavery altogether one day, which is exactly what happened. You know, in the 1860s with the Emancipation Proclamation, um, you know, this asserted federal dominance over the states, and that would not have been possible if it weren't for a unitary national government. All right, so we had the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, and eventually they did um, ratify the Constitution as we know it today. Um, and with the Massachusetts Compromise, Massachusetts once again. Um, so the Massachusetts Compromise said that the Anti-Federalists who were worried that a strong national government would step on the individual rights of the states and the people in the states, so they wanted amendments to the Constitution. And we know of these amendments today as the Bill of Rights. So freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to bear arms, all of these were enshrined in the Constitution as a way to get the Anti-Federalists to support ratification. All right. So looking forward, the United States then has a country. The Puritan sort of sensibility is, you can still see it in a lot of the literature. We know that slavery is a huge issue in the country, and we have some readings that describe the Middle Passage and other aspects of slavery. We have a lot of political writing from the time, because these were political times. People love to give their political opinions and argue in newspapers. So actually, a lot like today. So a lot of the people in colonial the United States would love to have their own blog or website that they could comment on. So the task going forward into the 19th century then would be for the nation to develop its own sense of identity, its own national literature, drawing on its experiences and its colonial past and some of the artistic and social things that had happened along the way. So as we go forward, think about how these traditions that we're looking at in the colonial and revolutionary periods will influence the topics and the way that people write and think about things into the 19th century. All right, so I hope that provides helpful context to the readings for this unit. Try to think about how they fit into these times and what people were thinking and what people were talking about, and how these readings sort of inform us about the time period and give us more of an idea of what defined the period. All right, well, I appreciate it.